The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, a merciless disk of fire pressing down on the earth. Heat shimmered off the red dust of the wagon road that led into Dry Creek, a town so small it was more rumor than map. The streets were empty, save for a few dogs that dozed in the shade of a water trough and the slow creak of a windmill spinning above the general store. Dry Creek had seen outlaws, soldiers, drifters, and miners come through its borders, but what rode into town that evening made even the most weathered cowhands pause. The figure came on horseback, though the horse looked near death from exhaustion. A tall Apache warrior, his long black hair tangled with dust and streaked with dried blood, swayed in the saddle. His buckskin shirt was torn, his skin bruised and cracked from days of riding without rest. He was the kind of man mothers warned their children about, the kind of man sheriffs kept their hands close to their holsters for. But it wasn't just his presence that froze the town in place, it was who followed him. Trailing behind, half walking and half stumbling, was a young Mexican woman. Her dress, once white, was dirt-stained and clinging to her with sweat. In her arms she held a baby, swaddled in a rough blanket, its cries weak but steady against the dry air. The sight of her was enough to stir whispers from porches and open doorways. The Apache dismounted slowly, sliding from the saddle with a grunt of pain. His boots hit the dust and he steadied himself against the reins. His sharp eyes scanned the town, suspicion meeting suspicion, before he untied his canteen and lifted it toward the woman. She refused at first, glaring at him with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. But when the baby whimpered, she accepted, drinking greedily before giving a few drops to the infant. By then, the sheriff had arrived. Sheriff Callahan was a tall man with gray in his beard and a Colt revolver that gleamed at his hip. He wasn't quick to anger, but he wasn't slow to judgment either. Stepping out of the jailhouse, he took one look at the pair and his hand instinctively brushed the butt of his pistol. "You there," Callahan barked, his voice echoing down the dusty street. "State your business." The Apache looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he helped the woman to a bench outside the saloon. Only then did he straighten, shoulders squared against the wary eyes fixed on him. "She's not my wife," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. The words spread fast, whispered from the blacksmith to the storekeeper, from the saloon door to the women peering out from behind curtains. Not his wife? Then what was she? A captive? A runaway? A scandal waiting to set Dry Creek aflame? The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "If she ain't your wife, then why is she following you? And what's with the baby?" The Apache's jaw tightened. He glanced at the child, then back at the sheriff. "Not mine," he said. The woman clutched the baby tighter, lowering her gaze to the ground. She still hadn't spoken, and her silence was almost louder than his denial. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Cowboys leaned against fence posts, miners squinted through the dust, and two school children watched wide-eyed from behind the church steps. Dry Creek was a place that lived on routine mail on Fridays, services on Sundays, trouble every so often, but this was something different. The Apache's denial rang out like a challenge, but it didn't answer the real question burning in everyone's minds. If she wasn't his wife, and the baby wasn't his, then why was he here? Why had he brought them into Dry Creek at all? The sheriff stepped closer, his spurs jingling with each step. "Son, I don't take kindly to lies. You bring a woman into my town with a babe in her arms. You best have a story worth hearing." The Apache's hand brushed the hilt of the knife at his belt, not in threat but in instinct. His eyes were sharp, yet hollow with fatigue. "I have no story," he said. "Only truth." The sheriff's lip curled. "Then speak it." The Apache glanced at the woman again. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes: hesitation, maybe even guilt. But just as quickly it was gone. replaced by the same cold defiance that had carried him across miles of desert. "She's not my wife," he repeated, louder this time, as if the weight of the words themselves might shield him from the suspicions closing in on all sides. And with that, the stage was set. Dry Creek had been many things, but it had never been a place for secrets. Now, with the setting sun casting long shadows across the street, every man and woman in town knew they were standing on the edge of one. The heat didn't ease as the sun slid behind the mesas. Instead, it thickened, clinging to Dry Creek like a fever. By nightfall, lanterns glowed in the windows, and the town's usual quiet gave way to a different kind of tension. A stranger could pass through and be forgotten, but a wounded Apache with a woman and child, now that was a story that refused to die quietly. Sheriff Callahan wasted no time. He ordered 2 deputies to keep watch on the boarding house porch where the woman had been given a cot and water. The Apache, despite his injuries, refused to rest under a roof. He squatted near the horse trough, sharpening his knife against a whetstone, as if daring anyone to try and drag the truth out of him. The townsfolk, though, didn't need an invitation to speculate. By the time the lamps were lit in the saloon, the story had already grown its own legs. "Kidnapped her, sure as sunrise," muttered Dan McCready, a miner whose face was as blackened with coal dust as his lungs. He nursed a whiskey, slamming the glass down with each accusation. "Look at her dress torn to rags. She didn't come with him willin'." Across the table, a cattleman named Jeb Rollins shook his head. "You don't know that. Might be she's run off from somewhere, found him on the trail. Could be he saved her?" "Saved her?" McCready barked a laugh. "Apache don't save nothin' but their own skins." The barkeep, polishing a glass, leaned closer. "What about the baby?" "You ask me. That's the strangest part. Doesn't cry for him, doesn't cry for her either. Just stares. As if it knows something we don't." At that, silence settled over the table. Even the piano player paused, letting the notes hang like questions in the smoke. Out on the street, Sheriff Callahan made his own rounds. He found the Apache where he'd been since sundown, a motionless shadow against the trough. The man's eyes gleamed faintly in the lamplight, watchful, unreadable. "You plan on speaking any more than you already have?" Callahan asked, his tone flat but edged. The Apache didn't look up. "I have spoken." Callahan stepped closer, boots grinding in the dust. "You say she ain't your wife. Fine. You say the child ain't yours. Fine again. But you expect me to believe you rode miles through hostile country, half dead on that nag of yours, for no reason? I wasn't born yesterday." Finally, the Apache lifted his gaze. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Believe what you want. I brought them here. That is enough." The sheriff studied him a long moment, the way a man studies a rattlesnake coiled just out of strike range. Callahan wasn't a fool. He knew Apache ways, knew how pride bound their tongues tighter than any rope. Still, pride didn't explain the way the woman had looked at him earlier, with something caught between fear and reliance. "She won't talk neither," Callahan muttered. "Just sits there with that child, staring at the walls." The Apache said nothing. His knife scraped against stone, steady, patient, as though time itself bent to his rhythm. By the next morning, suspicion had ripened into hostility. Mothers pulled their children away when the woman carried the baby down to the well. Shopkeepers raised their prices when the deputies asked for cloth and milk on her behalf. Men leaned on porch rails, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, their stares sharp as barbs. One boy, no more than 12, asked his father outright, "Pa, if she ain't his wife, why she stay?" The father tugged the brim of his hat low. "Some questions best left unasked, boy." But that was the problem in Dry Creek. Questions left unasked only grew heavier. That evening, when the church bell tolled 6 times, the sheriff called a meeting in the saloon. The townsfolk packed inside, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and judgment. Callahan stood by the bar, hand resting on his revolver, eyes scanning the restless crowd. "We got ourselves a situation," he began. "Man claims the woman ain't his wife. Claims the baby ain't his child. That don't answer the bigger matter why bring her here at all. Folks are scared, and scared folks make poor choices. From the back," McCready hollered, "hang him before he brings the rest of his kind down on us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Others shifted uneasily, torn between fear and decency. Callahan raised a hand, silencing them. "No man hangs on suspicion alone. Not in my town. But make no mistake, we'll get to the truth. One way or another." Out on the porch, unseen by the crowd, the Apache stood listening, the baby's soft cry drifting through the night air from the boarding house. His jaw tightened. He had spoken his truth, but in Dry Creek, truth without explanation was nothing more than a spark tossed into dry grass, and the grass was already smoldering. The next morning, Dry Creek wore suspicion on its face like a badge. The blacksmith hammered iron with extra force, each strike echoing the mistrust hanging over the town. Women whispered on porches, pausing their gossip only long enough to pull their children closer when the Apache walked past. Men tipped their hats stiffly, hands never far from their gun belts. The Apache, however, gave no sign of unease. He moved with the same calm defiance as when he'd first arrived, tending to his horse, watching the sky, ignoring the stares that burned holes through him. The woman, pale and silent, remained in the boarding house, venturing out only to fetch water. The baby, though weak, had a way of commanding attention with its cries, thin but insistent. Each wail seemed to tighten the knot of suspicion in Dry Creek's chest. By midday, the Apache walked into the saloon. It was a deliberate move. Every man knew that stepping into that place meant stepping into the heart of the town's judgment. The piano fell silent as he crossed the threshold. Boots scuffed against the floor. Cards were dropped on tables. Whiskey glasses paused halfway to lips. He made his way to the bar, every eye tracking his movements. Sheriff Callahan sat at a table near the back, his hand resting casual-like on his revolver. The barkeep, a wiry man with a permanent squint, leaned forward. "What'll it be?" "Water," the Apache said, his voice flat. The barkeep smirked. "Water's free at the trough. You want it in a glass, it'll cost you." A few men chuckled. The Apache's face didn't change. He set 2 coins on the bar. The barkeep's smirk faded, but he poured the glass anyway. As the Apache raised it to his lips, Dan McCready's voice cut through the room like a saw. "Heard tell you say that woman ain't your wife." The Apache lowered the glass slowly, setting it down with care. He turned, his gaze locking on McCready. "She is not." A murmur ran through the saloon. Men leaned forward, eager for the theater of it. McCready stood, puffing up his chest. "Then what is she? A hostage? A plaything? Don't reckon you dragged her here for charity's sake." The Apache's jaw flexed. His hand drifted to his belt, not quite touching the knife, but close enough to remind every man in the room of its presence. "She is not my wife," he repeated, his tone heavier this time, each word carrying the weight of finality. McCready sneered. "That all you got? She's not my wife?" Sounds like the kind of thing a liar says when he's too yellow to spit the truth. Sheriff Callahan rose before. Fists could fly or steel could be drawn. "Enough, McCready," he warned. "We're not going to turn this into a lynch mob." The miner spat into the sawdust. "You going to let him sit there, Sheriff, while the whole town wonders what he's done to that girl?" Callahan's eyes flicked to the Apache. "You're making it worse for yourself, son. You sit there, denying with no explanation, folks'll start imagining their own answers. And imagining's worse than truth. The Apache's gaze never wavered. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his voice carrying clear across the hushed room. "She is not my wife. The child is not mine. That is the truth." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Men exchanged glances, suspicion deepening. To them, denial without story was as good as confession. The woman's sudden appearance in the doorway broke the tension. She clutched the baby to her chest, her face pale but determined. For a moment, every man in the saloon stared at her, then at the Apache, waiting, hoping for some crack in the mystery, but she said nothing. She simply turned and disappeared back into the night, leaving the room heavier than before. The Apache drained the last of his water, set the glass down, and turned to leave. As he pushed through the swinging doors, McCready muttered, "Not his wife, not his child. Then what in God's name is she?" The answer hung in the dust-choked air, unspoken but swelling larger with every passing hour. Dry Creek didn't have patience for mysteries, and the Apache's denial was starting to feel less like a shield and more like a fuse dot by the fourth day. Dry Creek was no longer curious, it was restless. The Apache's denial, repeated like scripture, left the townsfolk hungry for a story to fill the silence. And in small towns, silence was never empty. It was an invitation for whispers. Whispers grew fastest at the edges of lamplight. In the boarding house kitchen, where the woman washed her baby's blanket in cold water, two matrons whispered behind her back. "She don't look kidnapped to me," one said, lowering her voice but not enough. "Don't flinch when he's near. Don't run when she's alone. Don't mean she ain't scared," the other countered. "Fear is a chain you can't always see." The woman's hands paused in the basin. Her dark eyes flicked up, but she said nothing. Silence had become her shield. The same as his dot at the saloon, the whispers grew darker. McCready fanned them like sparks into kindling. "I'll tell you what happened." He raided her village, cut down her kin, and took her for himself. That's Apache ways. And that child? Could be his after all, no matter what he swears. Others muttered agreement, though not all. Jeb Rollins slammed his whiskey down. "I seen men do worse in uniform, calling themselves soldiers. Don't go pointing fingers just 'cause he's Apache." But the doubt was planted, and in Dry Creek, doubt spread faster than prairie fire. The sheriff, meanwhile, watched it all with the weight of a man caught between duty and fairness. Callahan had lived long enough on the frontier to know that truth was rarely simple. He also knew a man could hide more behind denial than a woman could behind silence. That night, he sat outside the jailhouse, lantern glowing at his feet, when the Apache appeared. The warrior moved soundlessly, but Callahan had learned to expect him. He leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling into the dark. "You're letting this town turn itself inside out," Callahan said. A word or two could cool him down. The Apache stared into the shadows, silent. "Not asking you to spill your whole life story," Callahan went on, "but I need something. If you ain't her husband, then what are you to her?" For a long while, nothing stirred but the crickets in the grass. Then finally the Apache spoke, his voice low, distant, as though the words were pulled from somewhere far behind him. "Her village burned." Callahan sat straighter. "By who?" The Apache's eyes darkened. "Not my people. Cavalry." The sheriff frowned. He'd heard of such raid settlements wiped out under orders that never reached paper. Soldiers covering their crimes with fire and silence. "I found her," the Apache continued, his tone flat. "Among the dead. She lived. Others did not. And the child?" Callahan asked carefully. The Apache's gaze shifted, unreadable. "She carried him already." The sheriff studied him, trying to pierce the gaps in his story. "So you saved her?" The Apache's jaw tightened. "I carried her from the flames." That is all, but Callahan wasn't satisfied. He could tell there was more left unsaid than spoken. And he wasn't the only one who sensed it, because as the night stretched on, the woman herself lay awake in the boarding house, the baby curled against her chest. Memories clawed at her, the crackle of fire devouring her home, the screams of her people, the heavy silence afterward broken only by the sound of hoofbeats. She remembered his shadow falling over her, remembered his hands lifting her from the ash. She remembered hating him then for being alive when so many she loved were not. And yet, in the weeks that followed, she had clung to that same shadow for survival. Through hunger, through thirst, through endless miles of desert, it was his presence that kept her standing. He gave no comfort, offered no tenderness, but he did not leave her behind. That kind of bond wasn't easy to name. Not husband, not captor. Something in between, born from fire and carried into exile by dawn. Dry Creek's whispers had twisted into certainty. She had to be his. No Apache would guard a woman and child without claim. And no woman would stay beside a man she didn't belong to unless she had no choice. So when the baby's frail cry echoed across the street that morning, sharper, more desperate than before, the townsfolk listened. They watched the Apache stride into the boarding house, watched the woman place the child in his arms. He held the baby close, murmuring words in a tongue no one understood. The child quieted almost at once. And though the warrior's face remained carved from stone, the sight of him cradling that fragile life was enough to stir even the hardest hearts. But for the crowd gathering outside, it wasn't comfort they saw. It was proof of a secret, proof of a lie, proof that his denial was not truth but concealment, and with that the whispers grew teeth. The baby's cry pierced the stillness of Dry Creek like a church bell at midnight. It wasn't a soft wail of hunger that the townsfolk had grown used to hearing. It was sharp, ragged, and desperate, the kind of cry that turned spines cold. The boarding house doors swung open, and the woman staggered into the street, clutching the child to her breast. Her dark hair clung to her face with sweat, her eyes wide with panic. "I a dame," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Help me." In a town hardened by drought and gunfire, compassion was rare, but even the hardest men paused at the sight of a mother begging. A few women hurried forward, reaching for the child. But before they could touch him, the Apache appeared. He moved faster than anyone expected, a shadow cutting across the lamplight, and in an instant the baby was in his arms. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. The warrior pressed his cheek to the infant's, whispering words in Apache, a rhythm like a prayer. The child's cries eased, softening from shrieks to hiccuping sobs. By the time the baby finally quieted, his tiny fist curled against the Apache's chest. The street had fallen silent too. It was the first time Dry Creek had seen the man's armor crack. For a moment, his face softened, his shoulders bent protectively. He wasn't the untouchable shadow they feared. He was a man holding a fragile life, against the cruel edge of the world. The woman watched him, her lips parted, tears glinting on her cheeks. Something passed in her eyes, recognition, maybe even gratitude, but she quickly lowered her gaze, clutching the folds of her torn dress as if afraid to let her thoughts show. Sheriff Callahan pushed through the crowd, his voice steady. "Bring the baby inside." Doc Whitfield looked at him. The Apache hesitated. His dark eyes flicked over the townsfolk, men stiff with suspicion, women clutching their shawls, children peering wide-eyed from behind skirts. He knew what they saw, an Apache clutching a sickly white child. To them, it was evidence. To him, it was danger, but the baby stirred weakly, and with a reluctant nod, he carried the child inside. Doc Whitfield was a thin, sharp-nosed man with steady hands, a veteran of more battlefields than births. He cleared a table, lit a lamp, and gestured. "Lay him down." The Apache did as told, though his body hovered like a shield. The woman stood close, wringing her hands, whispering prayers in Spanish. Whitfield pressed his ear to the child's chest, frowned, and shook his head. Fever. Bad one. He's weak, might not last the night unless he gets rest and cool air. The woman let out a sob, clutching the edge of the table. The Apache, silent as ever, dipped a rag into a basin and began to dab the child's brow with deliberate care. Whitfield watched him, brows furrowed. You handle that child like he's yours. The words hung in the lamplight. The woman stiffened. The Apache didn't look up. He's not mine, he said quietly, though his hand never faltered. From the doorway, McGready's voice cut through like a knife. Then why's he calm in your arms and crying in hers? You explain that, Injun. The room tensed. Callahan shot McCready a warning glare, but the miner only smirked. Knowing he'd planted the doubt deeper, the Apache finally raised his head. His eyes were hard, his voice steady, though something trembled beneath it. I told you. He is not mine, but he lives. That is all that matters. The woman looked at him then, truly looked. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the weight of the room's eyes kept her silent. Instead, she reached for the baby's hand, pressing it to her cheek, tears streaking down her face. Whitfield packed away his tools. Child's sick, but he's fightin'. Keep him cool. Pray he makes it. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the whispers outside thickened like storm clouds. Men muttered that no Apache would tend a child that wasn't his. Women asked each other if they'd ever seen a mother let another man calm her baby so easily. Inside the boarding house, the Apache sat beside the cot, the baby in his arms, rocking slowly. He spoke words in his tongue, words no one else understood. The woman sat across from him, watching in silence, her eyes haunted by memory. And in that quiet, it was clear to anyone who saw them, whether by blood or by fate, a bond tied the three together, but the Apache still denied it. And with every denial, suspicion grew sharper. Like the edge of a blade waiting to be drawn. By the sixth day, Dry Creek was boiling over. What began as whispers had hardened into certainty, and certainty always demanded action. Folks weren't content to watch the Apache sit silent, guarding a woman and child while denying any tie to them. Suspicion had turned into anger, and anger was a dangerous thing in a town where half the men carried iron on their hips. The breaking point came at sundown. The saloon was crowded, lanterns throwing restless shadows across the walls, when Sheriff Callahan called the Apache inside. The warrior entered with his usual calm, though every eye fixed on him as though he'd brought a plague into town. The woman followed close behind, the baby wrapped in a blanket, its soft breaths barely audible over the noise. Callahan raised his hand for quiet. We're going to set the record straight tonight. No more rumors. No more half-truths. The room stilled. McCready leaned against the bar, smirking, waiting for the sparks to fly. The sheriff turned to the Apache. I've given you time, son. More time than most here wanted me to. But the town's patience is gone. You keep saying she ain't your wife, the baby ain't your child. Then tell us plain, why won't she leave you? And why won't you leave her? All eyes bore down on the warrior. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his face carved from stone. His silence stretched so long it felt like rope tightening around every neck in the room. Finally, his voice came, low but uncheckable. I gave my word. I will not leave her. The crowd erupted, some in disbelief, others in scorn. Word? McCready barked. You expect us to believe an Apache's word? She's with you 'cause she ain't got a choice. Admit it, you took her, and now you're hiding behind that child. The woman's face flushed, but still she said nothing. She clutched the baby tighter, her eyes darting from the sheriff to the Apache. As if torn between two impossible truths, Callahan slammed his palm on the table, silencing the room. Enough. This ain't about what you think you know, Macready. It's about what's true. And the truth still buried under silence. He turned back to the Apache. Why won't you speak it? If she ain't yours, why risk your neck to protect her? Why ride into a town that hates your kind just to keep her safe? The Apache's jaw clenched. He looked at the woman, just a glance, quick and sharp, but it was enough. Enough to set hearts pounding, enough to feed the fire already licking at the edges of the crowd's temper. Callahan caught it. His voice softened, though it carried weight. You can deny her with your tongue, son, but your eyes give you away. Folks see it. I see it. The Apache's hands curled into fists at his sides. His voice, when it came, was hard. She is not my wife. The words cracked across the room like a whip. The baby stirred in her arms, whimpering. She rocked him quickly, shushing him, but the sound seemed to deepen the silence that followed. Macready spat on the floor. Man's a liar. Look at the way she watches him. She ain't afraid. She's tied to him. And that baby don't matter what he swears, you can see it plain as day. The woman finally raised her head. Her eyes glistened, her lips trembled, but still no words came. The Apache stepped forward, standing between her and the crowd. Callahan's voice grew iron again. You can't keep hiding, son. This town won't stand for shadows. Give us the truth, or they'll carve their own out of lies. The Apache's chest rose and fell, his breath sharp through his nose. He met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. The truth is simple. She is not my wife. The child is not mine. That is all. A murmur spread through the saloon, heavy with disbelief. No one moved, no one spoke louder than a whisper, but outside beyond the lamplight, the storm was gathering. Dry Creek had been patient, but patience had run dry. And when patience runs out, the desert knows only one thing: reckoning. The night was thick with tension. The storm that had been gathering in Dry Creek finally broke inside the saloon. Though no rain fell, only words, sharp as bullets, ready to tear lives apart. The Apache's denial still hung in the air. She is not my wife. The child is not mine. He had repeated it so often that it sounded like scripture. But scripture didn't quiet suspicion, it only deepened it. The sheriff's patience, stretched thinner than wire, finally snapped. Enough, Callahan growled, his voice echoing against the saloon's walls. I won't let this town eat itself alive over silence. If the man won't talk, then maybe the woman will. Every head turned. The woman, pale but steady, stood at the edge of the lamplight, the baby clutched to her chest. For days she had kept her silence, carrying her secret like a stone pressed into her heart. But now, with the sheriff's eyes on her and the crowd restless as a pack of wolves, she knew there was no more hiding. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The Apache shifted, stepping closer, as if to shield her again. But this time she raised a trembling hand, not to hide, not to push him away, but to steady herself. He saved me, she said, her voice soft but clear enough to hush the crowd. The room went still. She drew a breath, her words spilling faster, as though once the dam broke she could no longer hold them back. My village burned. Soldiers came, not Apaches, but white men wearing uniforms. They killed without mercy. My father, my brothers, even my mother. Her voice faltered, but she clutched the baby tighter, forcing herself on. When the flames rose, when I had no one left, he came. He pulled me from the fire. He gave me water. He carried me through the desert when I could not walk. Gasps rustled through the crowd. Men shifted in their chairs. Some looked away, ashamed, while others hardened, unwilling to believe. The woman's eyes glistened as she continued. The child? He is mine. Born of that night. Born of soldiers, not of him. Her gaze flicked to the Apache, then back to the crowd. "But this man, the one you call Savage, he has been father to my son in every way that matters. He has fed him, carried him, kept him alive when the desert itself tried to claim us." Her words rang like gunshots in the silence that followed. The Apache stood motionless, his face unreadable, but in his eyes sharp, dark, unflinching. Something finally broke free. He looked at the child, then at her, and for the first time he did not deny. Callahan's jaw tightened. He turned to the warrior. "Is it true?" The Apache's voice was low, roughened by the weight of it. "I swore she was not my wife. I swore the child was not mine. That was my truth." He paused, his eyes steady, his tone sharpening like steel. "But blood does not matter. I have carried them both. I have stood between them and death. That makes them mine." The crowd erupted, some with disbelief, some with grudging respect, others with anger that a truth so plain had been hidden so long. McCready slammed his fist on the bar. "So it is his. He's been lying from the start." "No," the sheriff said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "He's been protecting them. From us." "From you?" Silence fell again, heavier than before. The woman sank into a chair, rocking the baby gently. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her face held relief, as though the burden of silence had finally lifted. The Apache remained standing, shoulders squared, gaze sweeping the room like a man daring anyone to challenge what had been spoken. He had denied for days, but now that the truth was out, he stood taller, not smaller. Stronger, not weaker. Sheriff Callahan drew a long breath, his hand brushing his revolver, not out of threat, but out of habit. "Well," he said, his voice steady, "there's your truth. You don't have to like it. You don't have to approve it. But you'll respect it, 'cause it's theirs. And in Dry Creek, a man or a woman gets to own their truth." The crowd murmured, restless, divided. But no one drew iron. Not yet. The Apache turned to the woman, then to the child in her arms. For the first time since arriving, his denial was gone, replaced by something quieter, but infinitely stronger. Acceptance. And Dry Creek, whether it wanted to or not, would have to live with it. Morning came to Dry Creek heavy and gray, the sun fighting through clouds that seemed unwilling to break. The town, restless after the night's revelations, stirred uneasily. Men lit their cigars earlier than usual. Women hung laundry with sharper snaps of the cloth. Children whispered the story they'd overheard, turning it into a tale larger than truth. The Apache didn't hide. At dawn he stood in the street, sharpening his knife with calm precision, the woman and child at his side. The baby's fever had broken. Though weak, he stirred with soft coos, his small hand reaching for the warrior's chest. The townsfolk gathered in doorways, watching, whispering. Mixed why was the first to break. He stomped into the street, spitting dust. "You expect us to swallow it? That this Apache just happened to save her, carry her, raise her brat like his own?" He sneered at the woman, then the baby. "We know what we saw last night. He's claiming them as his. That's all the proof we need." The Apache rose slowly, sliding the knife into his belt. His face was calm, but his presence was thunder waiting to break. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward, hand on his Colt. "Careful, McCready. You don't speak for this town." "The hell I don't," McCready snapped. "Ask him. Ask any man here if he trusts an Apache to raise one of ours." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, agreement from some, shame from others. The division cut the town in half, like a canyon widening by the hour. The woman clutched her baby, her eyes shining with fear and fire. "He is not one of yours," she said sharply, her Spanish accent thick but her meaning clear. "He is mine. And this man has been father where no other dared to be." Gasps rose. It was the first time she had spoken so boldly in public. Macready sneered. "You hear that? She's bewitched. He's fooled her, fooled the lot of you." His hand twitched toward his revolver. "Best we end this before it ends us." Time slowed. Callahan's hand dropped to his own gun, eyes locked on Macready. The townsfolk held their breath, knowing a single twitch could turn the dusty street into a killing ground. But the Apache moved first. Not toward his knife. Not toward Macready. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the woman, the baby, and the barrel of whatever gun might be drawn. His voice was steady, carrying over the tension like iron. "I told you she is not my wife. I told you the child is not mine. But I will not let harm come to them. If you aim at her, you aim at me. If you aim at the child, you aim at me." The weight of his words settled on the town like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Sheriff." Callahan broke the silence. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air like a whip. "You heard the man. He ain't lying anymore. He's claiming what's his, even if it ain't by blood. And I'll stand behind that. Any man who draws today, he draws against me." The crowd shifted uneasily. McReady's face reddened, his jaw working like a hinge about to snap, but the sight of Callahan's revolver and the steely resolve in his eyes held him back. With a curse spat into the dust, he turned and shoved his way through the crowd. The Apache remained where he stood, silent, unwavering. The woman reached out, brushing his arm, not with fear this time, but with quiet strength. The baby stirred, his tiny fingers gripping the folds of the warrior's shirt. For the first time, the Apache let his eyes soften. He looked down at the child, then at her, and when he lifted his gaze to the town again, his denial was gone. "She is not my wife," he said, his voice calm but ringing with truth. "But I will walk with her. She is not my blood, but she is my life. And this child," he touched the baby's hand gently, "this child proves it." The street was silent. Dry Creek, for all its prejudice and suspicion, knew a reckoning when it saw one. No man spoke, no gun was drawn. Some turned away in shame, others in quiet acceptance. Sheriff Callahan nodded once, slow and firm. Then it settled. Not by paper, not by preacher, but by choice. And sometimes choice is stronger than either. With that, the Apache turned. The woman fell into step beside him, the baby in her arms. Together they walked down the dusty street, past the murmuring crowd, past the judgment, past the whispers. The desert waited for them merciless, endless, but it was theirs. And as the three of them disappeared into the horizon, Dry Creek was left with the echo of words it would never forget. "She's not my wife." But the child proves otherwise.